Of course, bargaining is still a mask, a strategy, a manipulation. We practice it in the hope that whites will live up to the racial innocence we ascribe to them, but we don't know for certain that they will. Bargainers gamble that their own display of good faith will push whites into their better selves. When challengers reach for success and power in the American mainstream, they never give whites the benefit of the doubt. Quite the opposite. They use their moral authority as blacks to stigmatize whites as born racists. Challengers presume whites to be guilty of racism in the same way that bargainers presume them innocent, as a strategic manipulation. Challengers put all whites in the position of having to chase after their racial innocence. The Challenger's Code. Whites are incorrigibly racist until they do something to prove otherwise. Among blacks, challengers have no special power. But the instant they enter the American mainstream, the moral authority that goes with their black skin garners them enormous power. In a society where the greatest shame has been white racism, they have power over the guilt and innocence of whites. They can apply or remove what is arguably the most powerful stigma in American life, the racist stigma. This is a great power because it gives challengers a degree of control over the moral legitimacy of people and institutions. Nothing in American life ruins a career faster than the racist stigma. For uttering 3 clearly racist words, nappy-headed hose, the radio host Don Imus famously underwent something like career vaporization. A 35-year career in one of the country's toughest industries was completely stilled within days of his reckless remark. Once a person or an institution is stigmatized in this way, they become radioactive, the worst kind of pariah. To stand next to them is to be in the shadow of stigma. Imus's corporate sponsors fled immediately, fearing that the products they sell to the American people would have the taint of racism. Even a promotional tour for a new book by Imus's wife, scheduled to begin on the day he stepped down, had to be canceled. Despite days of abject and moving apology, and even the forgiveness of the women he had offended on the Rutgers women's basketball team, Imus found himself quite beyond redemption. Interestingly, the first man that Imus ran to see while in the depths of his ignominy was the Reverend Al Sharpton, clearly the most conspicuous challenger at work in America today. Sharpton is not wealthy, leads no movement, and is unelected to any office. Yet he is a self-appointed arbiter of the racist stigma, and thus a powerful man. Like a modern-day potentate, he can ruin or redeem a white man in one quick trip to the microphones. And though he has himself committed many of the sins that so outrage him in whites, he pays no price and loses no power when his hypocrisy is pointed out. The moral authority of simply being black, in a society shamed and compromised by its past treatment of blacks, makes Sharpton immune from the consequences he forces on white sinners. Rather than a pariah, he becomes a kind of priest. And so it was that Don Imus, hungering for redemption, got into a car, traveled uptown, and offered himself up for dispensation on Al Sharpton's radio show. Why didn't Imus go to visit Colin Powell? After all, Secretary Powell is a highly esteemed and lustrously accomplished American who is also black. How is it that he lacks Al Sharpton's powers of dispensation? Imus knew instinctively that someone like Powell would be no good for his purposes. Colin Powell is not a man who wields the racist stigma as his main source of power in American life. He is far more a bargainer than a challenger, someone who enters the American mainstream in the good faith that he will meet something like fairness. Sharpton, with little education or talent beyond being fast on his feet, with no background for mainstream success, relies entirely on the power of racial stigmatizing to make his way in America. He lives off the moral authority of his race's long suffering in America. Powell lives on his talents and energies as an individual, and his faith, nervous though it may be, that America can be fair to blacks. He has no special racial imprimatur to dispense. I'm sure it never crossed Imos's mind to visit him. Only a challenger can remove the racist stigma from whites with finality, and then only when they get something in return for the innocence they dispense. Challengers put themselves in charge of white innocence. They set the terms for it. They even specify the politically correct language it requires. They tell American institutions that they must practice affirmative action and diversity or have their legitimacy destroyed by stigmatization. And so institutions become obsessed with diversity, not because it is effective in achieving anything, but because it fends off stigma. It keeps the challengers at bay. If Imus ever returns to the airways, his operation will no doubt be swathed in diversity. Chapter 9. The Iconic Negro. In his memoir, The Measure of a Man, Sidney Poitier describes some of the behind-the-scenes intrigues and maneuverings that led up to possibly his most famous movie, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? A movie about a young black doctor coming to dinner at the home of a wealthy white family to ask for their daughter's hand in marriage required considerable subterfuge and the most careful negotiations to get off the ground back in the mid-60s. After all, the civil rights movement, on its deepest level, had been a war against white supremacy, an idea enforced by the taboo against interracial marriage. I remember that in the civil rights era we used to say, "We don't want to marry your daughter, we just want our rights." It was a way of allaying the very worst fear of many whites, that integration would turn into miscegenation. Then, a few years after winning our rights with the great civil rights legislation of the mid-60s, comes a film like Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, which seems to say, "Now we want your daughter too." Quite nervous about so radical a project, Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy felt the need to meet Sidney Poitier and take his measure before finally signing on. Now by this time, Sidney Poitier was one of the biggest stars in Hollywood, had been in more than 30 films, and had won the Best Actor Oscar a few years earlier. His measure had been taken many times and was there on the record for all to see. Why the need for more scrutiny? If it had been Paul Newman they were going to do a movie with, would they have checked him out so thoroughly? Wrote Poitier. In other words, here was a provocation that might have tempted Poitier to don the challenger's mask. Should I have been angry and confrontational? Black power had just then begun to sweep the country, and it admonished blacks no longer to suffer indignities from whites. Whites needed to be backed up, put in their place, retrained, as it were, on how to live without the props of white supremacy. But Sidney Poitier was not a challenger. Both on and off screen he was the quintessential bargainer. So he decided to give Hepburn and Tracy the benefit of the doubt. I looked at them as ordinary, decent folks. And in fact, they turned out to be that, and a hell of a lot more. Here was the classic bargain, the gift of innocence to whites in the hope that they would live up to it.